Okay. Well, first of all, I have to get comfortable and take my shoes off. Whoops, I don't need that. All right, well, good morning, and I'm so pleased to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. And before I start my teachings for today, please be aware that when we learn anything about trauma, when we learn anything about even hearing other people's stories, it can connect you to events that thread through your own life, even if it's not about pregnancy loss, abortion, sexual abuse. Because when we talk about trauma, there can be the trauma of a hurricane, or the trauma of a parent dropping dead in front of you, or trauma that you might have suffered with some of your children, and sicknesses and cancer and so many things that befall our lives because we're not in heaven yet. So trauma is part of all of our lives, and as I speak today, what I share may be relevant to you in your own situation, even though it's not about the topics. It's just how the body responds and reacts to trauma, and how we defend ourselves or engage in a way that helps us master that trauma. So be gentle with yourself today. If you find yourself triggered, you need to take a walk, please feel free to get up and take care of yourself. There's lots of counselors in the room. How many of you are counselors? And there's lots of peer supporters in the room. How many of you lead Bible studies and leadership? You wouldn't be here today if you didn't have a heart for people's pain, people's circumstances that put them in places and in crisis where they need support to cope. So I think you're among friends, even if some things surface for you today. I'll share with you how I got involved in the study and treatment of abortion trauma. I was in graduate school working on my master's degree in counseling psychology. And my first assignment ever, you know when you do an internship, my first assignment was to lead a support group for women that had eating disorders. My patients were anorexics and bulimics, and there was one compulsive overeater in the group. So every week we would meet and talk about everything, and it was really my job to just listen and try to facilitate the group and help people share. And I had a long history of youth ministry. So I was used to big groups of people with every teenager wanting to share. So I felt like this would be an easy thing for me. Well, the subject of abortion came up by Debbie. Debbie was having flashbacks and nightmares to her abortion experience. She said these images and memories are horrible enough, but that her ex-husband would call and leave messages on her answering machine, and he would call her a murderer. When she would get these messages, she had 3 children living in the home. They would hear the messages, and she would take out a razor blade and slit her wrist. It's kind of what we would call in psychology a borderline reaction. But she would slit her wrist so bad she would end up in the psych ward of the local hospital, because she would have to go in, and then they'd see she was kind of hysterical, and they would hospitalize her, usually for a period of 24 to 48 hours. And she had just been released. She had her gauze bandage all around her wrist, and she's sharing about her week and all the horror of that. Well, as we listened to Debbie, one of the women in our group said, "Your husband is a horrible man." She said, "I had an abortion too, and it would just kill me if somebody kept reminding me about it." And then another lady got up, and she started cursing and swearing. She stood up, she was waving her hands, and she was saying, "We have a right to control our bodies. Having an abortion is the best thing I ever did, and to hell with anybody who would try to make me feel guilty about having an abortion." And then there was another girl who actually got up, ran out the door, slammed the door really hard, and we could hear her tires screeching out of the parking lot. This was like a bomb going off in my group. Well, you knew that I would be a very compassionate, insightful, brilliant therapist someday, because I showed such keen insight when I called her up later that night and I said, "Are you okay? You seemed upset." And she proceeded to tell me, "I wish we could focus on eating disorders and stop talking about abortion." And I said, "Did you have one too?" She said, "It was a long time ago, and I don't want to talk about it." Well, when you're a student, You might remember, for any of you that have had to do internships, that you have to go and regurgitate everything that happens. I think they call them process notes. You have to write everything that happens, everything that was said, everything that you did or didn't do, so that you can go and be supervised by your supervisor. My supervisor was a psychiatrist. So he is listening to my story about what happened, and he leans forward in his chair and he goes, "You have no business prying into people's abortions. Having an abortion is a private, personal thing, and I was instructed not to allow any discussion of this personal, private issue." Well, he was totally in my space. I said, "I think that Debbie has post-traumatic stress disorder. She has nightmares, she has flashbacks." He said, "That's a psychotic reaction caused by her medication." And by the way, if anybody has a side effect like that, you're probably allergic to the medication, so you should, in most cases, get off it immediately. But he wanted to silence the discussion. I can only guess that he was involved in helping someone procure an abortion or forced someone to have one, and that he didn't want to hear about the problems afterwards. So I was pretty upset about that, and I left that group and started the first therapeutic support group for healing after abortion. I was about as clueless as I was in this group, but I saw that this was a microcosm of the bigger world. If you look out there, we have a lot of people like Debbie who are having active symptoms of trauma. Their trauma is live. It's ongoing. And they need our help and they need our support. You have other people who can't stand to hear the word abortion. That provoked the flee response. She had to get out as far away. You know, when I'm addressing pastors, they have to learn to talk about abortion in a way, because there's so many women, the minute they hear that word, are going to march out of the church. There's so many women that are brave enough to even be in church after abortion, but they're sitting in the very back row. You know why? So they can make a quick exit. So these are the flights of trauma. And then we have the woman that started to scream and swear and defend abortion rights. These are the feminists, the Nancy Pelosi's, the people out there who want to protect abortion at all costs. And in this case, in my little group, her rage actually shut down any meaningful discussion that we might have had about women's feelings after abortion. And with any addiction, it's not what you're eating, it's what's eating you. Whether it's workaholism or alcoholism or cutting behaviors or sexual addiction. These are all the things that bind anxiety and give us another problem to focus on and feel guilty about, rather than deal with the disgust and revulsion and grief and pain that many people experience when they're on an abortion table. So that was my entrance into this. I started that group. My groups were always full. I began them in it was a school at first, like a school library. They kept locking us out, forgetting that we were coming there on Thursday nights, and they would lock the door, so many times we would just sit in the parking lot and have our group. And then we were moved to the vestibule of a parsonage, like the vestibule, the place where you hang coats, because that was always open. And we would just sit there in basically a coat closet. So these were the humble beginnings of our ministry. And then my girlfriend let me use her house for a little bit. And along the line, my husband ended up becoming the administrator. He's a clinical social worker. He became the administrator of a maternity home. So we had a 40-bedroom old convent that we had turned into a maternity home. And at any given time, there might be 10 residents, so I had 30 extra basements, and I had real estate. So that's where we started Rachel's Vineyard as a retreat. I was having my children. I have 5 children, and so I was usually leaving to do my support group with a screaming baby at home, and men just have this problem. If they don't have breasts, they feel like they can't do childcare, because if a baby cries, there's only one thing that satisfies them. So he used to complain that I was always being out at night, and so I decided I would do the retreat on a whole weekend. That way I would get the whole thing over with, and it would give me more time to be home at night with the kids and get him off my back. So when I did that, I couldn't believe the benefits of going into the healing process without interruption. And I saw it as safe because I published a 15-week support group, and girls would be stirring up their memories and their feelings, and then they would be hitting the bar on the way home. And the last thing I wanted was for someone to get in an accident, and people did the same thing after therapy. And then if you're sick, you miss a whole a whole big chunk of the healing journey. And there was sometimes people would just feel this is too painful, and so there might be some attrition. The group would drop off a few people. But when I did the weekend and I saw the benefit, I thought I'll never go back to a support group. You can do support groups before and after, but for the trauma chunk of the meat, I wanted everyone to be together. I didn't want there to be a possibility that someone would be alone and want to drink a bottle of wine, as they're doing this. And a lot of people were fearful that if they open up this subject, they're not going to be able to function. They're not going to be able to put their kids to bed when they get home. They're going to not be able to go to work the next day because they'll be in bed all the night thinking about it. So to just separate from all your responsibilities and go away seemed to be a really wonderful, wonderful benefit that I didn't expect. You know how God gives you a dream, but then he puts a lot of people and things in your life to actually make it happen. Even the people who might torture us for a while, there's a reason that God's using for that. You don't realize that when you're going through it, but you can look back and say, there was a reason for that. So that was my intro. And just to give you some statistics, and this has dropped just a little bit by a few points, probably because of all the tremendous work of so many good crisis pregnancy centers, and now with the internet, all the information that's out there that's offering other kinds of help. But 43% of all women will have had an abortion by the age of 45. That's from the Alan Guttmacher Institute. That's the research arm of Planned Parenthood. And 50% of post-abortive women who are surveyed hide past abortions from researchers. And you know what else? They also hide them, as you heard this morning, from their best friends, from their sisters, from even their husbands. There's a lot of people who don't tell anybody it's a secret they think they're going to take to their grave. And one particular study was showing how this is true in medical records. Like you go to an OBGYN, you're not even going to tell your own gynecologist you had an abortion because of shame. And so when you're having complications or an incompetent cervix, or, we'll talk about all these things, but it's because of that shame. And women who don't reveal past abortions are much more likely to have unresolved feelings of shame, guilt, or grief attached to their experience. So we're going to look at what constitutes trauma today. And these books are out there. I don't know how many you have, but this is a textbook of anything I could teach you about trauma as it relates to abortion trauma. The study of trauma has historically been marked by controversy and political maneuvering. We know this through the ages. In the 1800s, Freud was actually the first trauma theorist. Did you know that? He was working with a lot of women who had hysteria, and hysteria means, the Latin word actually means womb. And so a lot of these women had painful body memories in their womb area, and as he was listening to them tell about their story and their life and their childhood, he learned that all of them had histories of sexual abuse. All of them. So here they are having what we would consider now to be mental health symptoms. But back then, they just called it hysteria, and they wanted to study it. And he started to talk about sexual abuse, and sexual abuse was so endemic in the culture, was so part of even the bourgeois to the poorest families, that he would have been the laughing stock of Vienna because it wasn't politically correct to say that this behavior that everyone engages in is causing a problem. We see that same thing today with the APA, the American Psychological Association, who wanted to remove abortion as even a stressor leading to anxiety and depression. They removed that even as a stressor. It used to be in there listed as a stressor. So anyway, with Freud, he he realized he wouldn't have a career much longer if he stayed on this vein, and so what did he do? He developed psychoanalysis. You know, the Oedipal complex. Women have lots of problems, but penis envy is not one of them. And yet we all had to learn that, didn't we? We all had to, anybody who studied psychology had to go through and learn that. Well, these people were left to just be researched and looked at through the lens of psychoanalysis as a Freudian viewpoint. And in World War I, soldiers were coming back from the war with, guess what, symptoms of hysteria. They were leaning over, holding their bellies, rocking under tables, going into dissociative trances, crying like women. And that wasn't considered politically correct because the image of a soldier had to be strong, had to be G.I. Joe, had to be like big, strong American soldier. So anybody with PTSD after the war was relegated to being ostracized, and they thought that they were weak and had a defective character, that they couldn't hold up under the pressures of war. Same thing happened after World War II. We saw a big wave again of soldiers suffering the same symptoms. And it wasn't until Vietnam War when the soldiers got together in coalitions of support for each other that they were able to bring attention to their syndrome, their post-traumatic stress disorder, and then get the attention of the psychiatrist and the psychologist and actually have it as a diagnosable illness in the DSM. The DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical just Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's sort of like the Bible through which, for you to get your insurance to pay for any kind of treatment, you need a diagnosis code. All those codes are in the DSM. That's why it's important, because if you're suffering from something that's not in the DSM, well, then it's all in your head. There's something wrong with you. And then you can't get your treatment paid for. Or even worse than that, if you're suffering from something very normal, like the unnatural and violent death of your child from an abortion, and you're freaking out and no one's recognizing it as a syndrome, after a little bit of time of being shut down and not listened to and having your grief dismissed, it's easy to think that you're what? Exactly. So nobody's crazy. Nobody's crazy. Even crazy people aren't crazy. Every crazy person I ever worked with had a lot of trauma. And we're going to talk about the effects of trauma on the whole nervous system, the whole physical system, medical system, all that. So post-traumatic stress disorder, let's look at that. It's a psychological disorder that results from a traumatic experience that overwhelms a person's normal defense mechanisms. So it's something out of the ordinary that happens that you weren't expecting that overwhelms your ability to deal with the stress. A traumatic event is defined as any event where one witnesses or experiences the actual death of somebody or the threat of death to someone. You could watch somebody in a store being held up who is never actually shot, but the fear of it almost happening can be enough to cause PTSD. People can get PTSD after a car accident, and they can be afraid to get behind the wheel of a car again. Anything that you go through where your life or someone else's life is threatened can bring that on. So a threat to the physical integrity of oneself or others. And this is how a lot of people experience the loss of a child in an abortion or in a stillbirth or even in a miscarriage. So what I'm saying about pregnancy loss and abortion can also go when someone has miscarriage. The shock of this experience is so great that the person's defenses become disorganized and disconnected from reality. And this can just happen for a temporary short period, you know, when you're in a state of shock. How many of you have ever felt a state of shock? You learn somebody died, and some people hear their mother died and they feel like, oh, I have to go grocery shopping first. I have to, and they start, one lady I know went out and bought like a brand new wardrobe. She was just trying to put her mind on something that she knew wouldn't allow her to take in the reality because it was too much. So traumatic events are accompanied by intense fear, horror, and a profound sense of helplessness. So a clinical diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, you have to have symptoms in 3 main categories. I'm going to teach you that this morning so you can be good diagnosticians. And we're going to look at what those symptoms are. And before I do that, I just wanted to read this little thing about war. We have a soldiers retreat I'm piloting now. It's called Duty to Heal, Finding Peace for a Soldier's Heart. And I know New Heart of Texas will be bringing it here as soon as it's available, because Mary Lee has a military family. But I thought this was a nice description. I've never served in the Army, but I have been to war. I've been on a battlefield and experienced the pain of a secret struggle. What I learned too late was that when I left the clinic that day, I would never again find peace. I never realized when I signed on the dotted line that I was enlisting for active duty in a terrible battle for the rest of my life. I didn't know that when I signed my child's life away for the false promise of peace, that I would leave that day with horrible scars. Not a day has passed since I left that place, alone and empty, that I am not burdened by those wounds. They are my self-imposed and inescapable prison for making a decision I had no right to make. Every moment, every event, and every person I have encountered has borne witness to my endless struggle. The torment that is now my constant companion since my innocent lost child lost his life is part of me. I can no longer recognize myself without this pain or shame. These are the scars that I bear. Will there ever be reprieve from this grief? I am tired and worn beyond my years from my never-ending battle. Though I know it was wrong, though I am truly sorry, this war will never end. I have so far survived this fight, but I know I will never find peace. It has been replaced with pain, anger, hatred, shame, depression, distrust, disillusionment, sadness, and isolation. One thing I must say to anyone who thinks an abortion will bring them peace is that they are horribly, horribly mistaken. It is my hope that this analogy will show what truly happens on the other side of those clinic doors. If just one person sees the truth and nightmare of abortion, this letter has served its purpose. The harsh reality is that the last time I had true peace was when I still carried my baby within me. I lost it only when I signed away my baby's life for a lie. I like the analogy she made to the battle, and I wanted to tell you real quick, because we all hear about war trauma, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that as it relates to trauma for those of you that are in military families or might be yourself. But we piloted the soldiers retreat. Before I wrote it, I wanted to make sure that my technique of living scripture, which I'll describe, would work with the soldiers. So I decided to pilot it on the group that was the most hard-hearted by training, which is Special Forces. So in Florida, we brought together a group of Special Forces, and we actually let them go through a Rachel's Vineyard retreat. And they were invited to grieve whatever they would, as we do for anyone who's not post-aborted. You find some issue to grieve, and you enter the process. So there was one guy that was a career Special Forces, and now he's a consultant for the government. His whole life he served. And his wife's a psychologist, and she's telling me he needs help, he needs treatment, but he thinks he's perfectly fine. So he comes to the retreat, and he's got a real attitude like, I don't know why she's dragging me on, this stupid psychologist wife, and thinks that I need to be here, and okay, here we go, because she's not going to let up on me until I do it. Well, the very first exercise, which is blind Bartimaeus, for those of you that have been on the retreat, and I'll describe it later, he runs out of the room when it's over because he was feeling, and he couldn't show his pain in front of everybody. He runs into the room, and of course she jumps up and chases after him. She said that when they got in the room, he closed the door behind them and he collapsed into her arms sobbing. So I was like, yes, I know it worked. Thank you, Jesus. Well, there's always that, yes, that's great, and then there's, oh crap, now I have to write a retreat. So anyway, that at the very end of the retreat, the soldiers said to the post-abortive men and women, I used to think that there wasn't anybody in the whole world who understood what we went through on the battlefield, but you guys do. In fact, I think you have it worse than we do because it was your own children you killed. So I thought, wow, Lord, do you ever have a plan here? We have boots on the ground in 83 countries and half the world is at war. We have Rachel's Vineyard in Lebanon. It's the post-aborted people that are doing the healing in these ministries. They have a heart for it. They understand the pain. They know what it feels like to have nightmares and flashbacks. And they're very, very attentive. So does God have a plan to take the worst, most horrible, shameful, despicable events and then use them for his glory, to build his kingdom, to bring healing? That's why we need to heal, right? Because there's a mission out there. Like Chris said, you were being sent to do ministry, and she's like, what? God has a plan in all of it. And we have to trust that he doesn't remove our pain, but he can fill it with his presence, and then miracles happen.